excited to learn from the keynote tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Susan Collins. Dr. Collins is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which is part of the U.S. Central Bank. She is also a member of the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets federal monetary policy. Since taking office in July 22, Dr. Collins oversees all of the bank's activities, including economic research and analysis, and she just told us that she is a real data geek. So if you want to get excited, come with a spreadsheet of some kind of data where you can slice and dice the data, whatever that they at the end tell you. She is also responsible for banking supervision, obviously, and financial stability efforts, and importantly, community development initiatives. In addition, a wide range of payment, technology, and financial initiatives. Dr. Collins is an internationally recognized macroeconomist with a lifelong interest in the connection between policy and living standards. She has published widely and served as provost, dean, professor, research scholar at a number of different important institutions, and is a board member, including work at University of Michigan, Brookings Institution, the Harvard University, then Georgetown University, and many more. Dr. Collins earned a PhD in economics at MIT and an undergrad degree at Harvard. So without further ado, I welcome you, Dr. Susan Collins, and look forward to your lecture.
First, thank you so much for such a warm introduction, and I'm just really delighted to be here with all of you this evening. I especially want to thank Paul Matthews, the Executive Director and CEO of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau, for just helping to put this wonderful event together, working with our team at the Boston Fed. And it's really great to be here in New England's second largest city, incorporated over 300 years ago, a wonderful, vibrant history. And as the Bureau points out, with a population that has really been growing, especially since 1980. It's also just a pleasure to congratulate the Bureau on its 39 years of public service and really impactful work, and we've heard a little bit about that. I have to say congratulations on a pretty exciting year. As a former public policy school dean, I recognize the value of that important work. And so just more broadly, to congratulate the Bureau on its impartial, empirical, nonpartisan research. It's also impactful in terms of its convening and its educating. And so I particularly appreciate the focus that the Bureau brings, and I have to say I enjoyed seeing this prominently on the website, and that is turning data into insight. So there's clearly a kindred spirit between the work that the Bureau does and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's work, which it's just a pleasure to point out. So, of course, we rigorously use data and models and analysis to shape our policy making. And we complement that by listening to people in a variety of different contexts across our economy, understanding both the challenges and also the opportunities that they face and that they see. That really complements and enriches our understanding. And so for all of you who are here tonight with us this evening, it's just really great to see your engagement and your commitment to the region's prosperity, and it's a commitment that we share. So I'm going to cover two things this evening. First, most of my remarks will focus on my economic outlook and my monetary policy views, including just a little bit of some of the analysis that we have underway at the Boston Fed. And then that national context will help provide a frame for my second topic, which is the economies of New England, Massachusetts, and Greater Worcester. And I want to briefly share some perspectives on economic contributions of smaller cities and the areas that surround them, and also some thoughts that are based on the Boston Fed's efforts to support opportunities for everybody to participate in our economy. So let me start with the national economy then. And as always, a disclaimer, these represent my own views, and I am not necessarily speaking for my colleagues at other reserve banks or at the Board of Governors. I always like to share my bottom line up front. I think it's helpful in terms of framing things. And so I'll start by saying the U.S. economy is in a good place overall, and monetary policymakers are working to maintain that. Recent developments have increased my confidence that inflation will return to the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC's 2% target in a timely way, and crucially, will do so amid a healthy labor market. So looking ahead, preserving the current favorable economic conditions will require additional adjustment to the stance of monetary policy so as not to put unnecessary restraint on demand. And a careful data-based approach to normalizing policy will be appropriate as we balance the risks, which are two-sided, and as we remain highly attentive to both price stability and maximum employment, which are the two parts of the mandate that the Fed has from Congress. So I want to say a bit more about these points in my remarks, and having already been introduced as a data geek, of course, I'm going to use a few charts along the way. So let me start with that. So let me start with a bit of historical context in Figure 1. And this is historical context related to those two parts of our mandate, price stability and maximum employment. The panel on the left shows the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, and that's calculated using the PCE, or Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. The blue line is total, sometimes called headline inflation, and that is moving back towards the FOMC's 2% target, and that target is shown by the green line. The red line is core inflation, and core inflation we often look at because it does provide often a better measure of where the trends are, but it also excludes the obviously very important categories of food and energy. And then the gray bars in this chart and others that I'll show represent recessions. The panel on the right shows the unemployment rate path, and it highlights just how unusual this post-pandemic recovery has been. Instead of what is typically a gradual decline in unemployment after it spikes in a recession, unemployment fell very quickly after spiking this time around. And as I've discussed in other talks, a variety of factors, are at play here. So in particular, many factors led to demand outstripping supply, including in the labor market, and these unsustainably tight conditions contributed to price and wage pressures that fueled the surge in inflation. And as we have seen so clearly, high inflation really impacts all of us and is especially challenging for those with lower incomes. And I certainly continue to hear about the challenges from inflation and high price levels as well as I speak with people in communities across New England. So looking a bit more at inflation, Figure 2 focuses on core inflation, which, as I mentioned, tends to more reliably capture inflation trends. In particular, the darker line shows that the 12-month measure has declined but remains elevated. This chart also shows a 3-month average measure, which reflects more recent data, which is helpful, but it also is much more volatile or noisy. And that highlights the unexpectedly large jump in inflation at the beginning of this year after the encouraging progress that we saw at the end of 2023. The good news is that the disinflation process has resumed, and I see that as driven by economic developments that are broader and also more solidly in place than they were at the end of last year. And this is one of the things helping to increase my confidence that inflation is firmly on a trajectory back to the FOMC's 2% target. So I want to explain a little bit more about inflation by decomposing it into its three components, and those are shown in this chart here. And the reason for doing that is that the three components actually behave quite differently and provides a bit of insight into what the dynamics and the patterns have been. So in the second half of 2023, the disinflation that we saw was largely due to a quite rapid deceleration in core goods prices. And that's shown in the first panel in this chart. And since then, the contribution of core goods prices to the overall disinflation process has moderated, right? Because a lot of the initial was as many of the challenges related to supply chain disruptions receded. The contributions have moderated, but inflation developments in this area of core goods continue to be favorable and actually in line with trends pre-pandemic. The contribution of services inflation to the overall disinflation process has resumed, but services inflation is still somewhat elevated. If you look at the chart on the far right, that shows that after a big jump in early 2024, core services prices, excluding housing, and I'll come back to housing in a moment, has been expanding at a rate that is more consistent with 2% inflation overall, and that's also good news. So what about housing inflation? And that's shown in the middle panel. That has also moderated more recently, but this is the component of inflation that is the most sticky, and it clearly remains above its pandemic average despite some of those recent improvements. At the same time, there's some good reasons to think that the stickiness in current shelter inflation reflects existing rents that are still catching up to the new market rents. In fact, the rent for newly signed, and here I repeat the shelter price inflation one, but have an additional chart, which shows that the rent for newly signed leases has been at or below its pre-pandemic range for many months after surging earlier. And that's shown in the right panel of this figure. So the data actually don't suggest the emergence of new inflationary pressures, but it's difficult to predict just how long this rent catch-up process may take, and that accounts for quite a bit of most of the stickiness that we are seeing in inflation. The moderation in new rent growth also reflects a labor market that's normalizing and reducing price pressures in the services sector more generally, because labor costs are actually a main driver of services inflation, and a labor market with supply and demand in better balance is a key reason for the disinflation becoming more broad-based and for my increased confidence that inflation is on that sustained path back to 2%. So let me turn to the labor market. The constellation of data point to notable softening, and I'll say a bit more about each of these charts in a moment, about notable softening from what were unsustainably tight conditions a year ago. And the goal is not further cooling in labor market conditions. Recent data, including the September unexpectedly robust jobs report, bolster my assessment that the labor market remains in a good place overall, and by that I mean not too hot or too cool. So figure 5 shows just a few of the many indicators that my team and I review when we assess labor market health. First, the unemployment rate rose from very low levels over the past year, but it's recently ticked back down and it remains low by historical standards. Second, although the middle panel shows that job growth slowed notably in recent months, it remains relatively solid. But here I do want to note that the recent job growth has been somewhat concentrated in a few sectors, and this is one of the factors that I continue to monitor. And finally, the third panel highlights both the low level of initial claims for unemployment insurance, and that indicates a quite healthy labor market, and also the muted levels of continuing unemployment insurance claims, suggesting that unemployed workers can find jobs relatively quickly. So I mentioned previously that this has been a highly unusual economic cycle, and I want to spend just a little bit more time on one dimension of that. So this figure compares the evolution of the employment to population ratio in this cycle, and that's shown by the blue lines, with the average pattern from the past 3 recession cycles, which are shown by the red lines. So clearly the drop in employment was much more sudden and steeper this time around. And while that's true across age groups, there are actually notable differences in the employment patterns during this recovery. For workers aged 25 to 54, which is the middle panel, the employment to population ratio returned to the pre-crisis level much more rapidly than had been true in prior episodes. In contrast, the panel on the right shows that a persistently lower share of people aged 55 and older are working post-pandemic. This accounts for the total employment to population ratio, which was on the left-hand panel, still being somewhat below its pre-pandemic peak. This pattern is really quite different from prior cycles, and it points to a set of issues that are particularly relevant for New England, which is the US region that has the oldest population. Figure 6 is also a reminder that the aggregate data mask what are often significant differences in experience across demographic groups, across sectors, and also across locations. So with the labor market cooling, wage growth is also moderating, but remains above its pre-pandemic level. And here I want to emphasize that the current still elevated wage growth also reflects robust gains in worker productivity and therefore should not necessarily lead to additional price pressures. So recent analysis by Boston researchers makes this point in more detail. In this figure, the data shows that for the past year, nominal wage growth, shown by the blue line, and that's measured here by the ECI, or the Employment Cost Index, nominal wage growth has exceeded PCE inflation, which is the red line. But this follows a period in which inflation outpaced wage growth, so wages in part are catching up to past price increases. Furthermore, real wages, or wages adjusted for inflation, should track growth in worker productivity over the medium to longer term. And real wage growth over this recovery has yet to match productivity gains, which have actually been quite solid. Given the developments in prices, wages, and productivity so far, the projections part of the chart illustrates our estimate of how nominal wage growth could continue to exceed inflation for a while and still remain consistent with the ongoing disinflation process. In fact, recent data revisions that raise the level of GDP and point to lower employment suggest that productivity may be understated by current measures. And overall, that's some good news for workers. As I mentioned before, I still hear very much about people struggling with high price levels and the accumulated effects of past inflation. So going forward, it will be vitally important to preserve healthy labor market conditions, and in my view, this will require economic activity continuing to grow close to trend, and that is my baseline outlook. Recent data do show activity continuing to grow at a solid pace overall, and importantly, the fundamentals underpinning consumer spending remain favorable, including the job opportunities that I've talked about and the gradual recovery of real wages. However, I call myself a realistic optimist, and that includes recognizing that there are risks on both sides of this favorable outlook. Figure 8 shows two demand-related indicators. On the one hand, household net worth remains quite elevated by historical standards, and that's shown on the left-hand side. And this could contribute to a faster than expected pace of growth in consumer spending. At the same time, there's strains starting to emerge, especially at the lower end of the income distribution. For example, credit card delinquencies, which are shown in the right-hand panel, have risen to above pre-pandemic levels, even though they're still low by recent historic standards. So the next phase of monetary policy must focus on preserving the current favorable economic conditions, a sustainable return of inflation to target, and a strong labor market are both critically important. A restrictive monetary policy stance played a key role in the disinflation progress so far, and recent data on spending and production indicate that the effects of restrictive policy are being felt, especially in interest-sensitive sectors of the economy. With the labor market cooling and economic growth reverting to a more normal pace, the economy is somewhat more vulnerable to adverse shocks. And so while my confidence in the disinflation trajectory has increased, so as well have the risks of the economy slowing beyond what is needed to restore price stability. So for these reasons, the FOMC began easing the policy stance at its meeting last month. I saw an initial 50 basis point reduction as prudent in this context, recognizing that monetary policy does remain in restrictive territory. Further adjustments will likely be needed, and the median projection from the FOMC Participants' Summary of Economic Projections, or SEP, which was released at the end of the last month's meeting, includes an additional 50 basis points of cuts in the federal funds rate this year. But I do want to stress that policy is not on a preset path and will remain data dependent. It's important that policy be adjusted as the economy evolves. So, switching to smaller cities and central Massachusetts with the national economy as context, I would now like to offer some perspectives on smaller cities, the areas that surround them, and some observations as well about central Massachusetts and greater Worcester. Like the Bureau, the Federal Reserve serves the public, and by that I mean all of the public. So while superstar cities might get a lot of buzz, we care deeply about smaller cities and rural areas and the economic experience of the people in them. In fact, a large portion of the Massachusetts population, more than a third, lives outside of the Boston metro area, and about a third of that population live in Worcester County. People are, of course, fundamental to economic activity, and we've already talked a bit about population growth. This figure shows population trends since the year 2000. And as you likely already know, population growth in Worcester County has exceeded the state average, fueled in part by rapid population growth in the city of Worcester, which has grown quite a bit faster than in Boston in the period since 2010. Of course, New England's smaller cities have been buffeted by cross-currents of economic history, often driven by technological change. And certainly the decline in the manufacturing sector's share of employment has been a powerful current affecting Worcester, the Commonwealth, and the entire United States, and that's shown in this figure, figure 11. While the drop in the share of employment concentrated in manufacturing was nationwide, Worcester was particularly hard hit given the previous importance of the sector here. Still, Worcester's population growth speaks to its more recent and ongoing revitalization, leveraging assets such as location, strong local leadership, and developing an important mix of sectors. Particularly notable over the last decade has been very rapid employment growth in professional and business sector services, at more than twice the pace of growth in Massachusetts and in the US more generally. And speaking of developing sectors, I do want to just take a moment to highlight biomedical sciences and RNA biology in particular, and to congratulate UMass Chan Medical School researcher Victor Ambrose and his collaborator Gary Ruthken of Massachusetts. Yes, absolutely, a huge congratulations. For sharing, of course, the Nobel Prize that was just very recently announced. And as you, I'm sure all know, this is the second time a UMass Chan scientist has been recognized with the Nobel. So I'd also like to share some thoughts about how smaller cities and rural areas around the country and in New England do find economic resurgence in the face of long-term challenges like a loss in manufacturing jobs. Over the last decade or so, the Boston Fed, motivated by our mandate to support maximum employment, has learned and shared a great deal related to this topic. Our research and experience shows that an essential element for resurgence is local leaders who are willing to collaborate across sectors on shared goals and strategies. Of course, it's easy to say this, it's a lot more difficult to do. Thoughtful experimentation can lead to new approaches that support economic vibrancy. And within the Boston Fed's Working Places initiative, I'd like to highlight an effort that we call LELE, which stands for Leaders for Equitable Local Economies. It's an 18-month experiment that began in 2021, and it had actually great success here in Worcester. And so, in particular, I wanted to note the Reimagining Civic Engagement in Worcester, Massachusetts initiative, and that was a LELE team that was led by Casey Burns, Gina Platanino, and Etel Hajiai. And that team was really quite innovative and successful, and they worked with the city to implement a participatory process for distributing funds from the 2021 American Rescue Plan. And that was, of course, a plan that was intended to support communities that were hardest hit by COVID-19. Ultimately, their team helped bump Worcester's allocation from 10 million up to 50 million. And I have to say, that's a pretty nice example of building civic infrastructure that engages and that includes everyone. Yeah. So more generally, we, working with so many partners, are exploring ways people can grow the playbook of effective local strategies. For instance, some locales have focused on business retention and recruitment and strengthening neighborhoods. Others, local leaders have decided to focus on reducing impediments to participation in the labor force, perhaps addressing tangible problems like job readiness, childcare, and transportation. And in still other locations, people are focusing on entrepreneurship support and access to information about jobs being available where people go every day, like their kids' schools. Again, a key is local people coming together from various sectors to determine and then to work together on shared objectives. So in concluding, I hope it's evident that our focus at the Boston Fed really is on a vibrant economy that works for all, not just for some. That spirit motivates me and the team to study and analyze economic data and to contribute in a rigorous manner to monetary policy making. And it also motivates me to travel the region, hearing from stakeholders across the economy, and this figure just gives some pictures from some of my recent trips. It's why I was delighted to gather with some Worcester leaders earlier this afternoon, and it's why I'm heading to Vermont this evening for a series of meetings there tomorrow. Hearing from New Englanders with diverse perspectives about both the challenges and the opportunities that they see in the economy really helps me fulfill my responsibilities as a policymaker, and I have to say, it is just a truly wonderful part of the job. So in addition to our monetary policy work, the Federal Reserve supports Main Street economies in a variety of ways, often quietly and behind the scenes. Our support includes financial stability work, most directly through safety and soundness supervision, providing payments and financial services infrastructure, such as through the FedNow Instant Payment Service, which was launched just over a year ago, conducting objective research and analysis, as I've discussed, and convening experts and community members around key topics. There are no shortage of challenges in our economy, but there are just so many opportunities as well. And I certainly believe that there are real opportunities here in central Massachusetts, actually in all of Massachusetts, and opportunities for New England to thrive. The keys are engagement, cross-sector collaboration, analysis, innovation, and also commitment. There clearly is an abundance of those things here in Worcester and in Central Mass, and so I look forward to further collaboration, and I wish you continued great success. So thank you, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Dr. Collins, what are the research priorities that you have in the near term that address the economic resiliency and more specifically related to workforce housing and affordability?
Yeah, so let me unpack that a little bit. Maybe I'll talk first about research priorities and then say a bit about housing. So we do have a very broad portfolio, and it all is directly related to our congressional mandate. And so in addition to price stability, of course, the maximum employment piece. And so we have a range of things that we work on in that context. Some I've already mentioned. I talked a little bit about the work related to wages, productivity, and prices. We also, and that work is actually already available on our website, we have work forthcoming that is related to labor supply in New England, but more specifically related to some of of the resilience kinds of topics, we see barriers to participation in the economy as being a challenge related to maximum employment. And so we do have work on a range of topics in that space, including related to things like childcare, things related, to some of the workforce development things that I mentioned before. So there's a range of research in that context. And that relates directly as well to housing. It is the thing that I hear about the most frequently as I talk to stakeholders across the region. Is something that is challenging. And I do have to say that the availability and affordability of housing is an issue across the income range. It is a quite broad issue. So certainly for individuals, a house is both important as a basic need, and also is likely the most significant asset. Is important for contributing for wealth development in a variety of different contexts, and that matters. I also hear from employers about the challenges related to availability of housing in terms of being able to hire, and that's one of the most frequent things that I hear as well. So there are a lot of dimensions to the housing challenges that we are facing, and some of them relate to the Federal Reserve. So our work certainly impacts, trying to control inflation, and the borrowing costs connect with us and some of the research that we do. But a lot of the other things that influence housing supply really relate to others who play a key role. And so it's going to take all of us working together to be able to address the very real housing challenges that we face across the country and certainly here in New England.
Dr. Collins, with the growing demand for skilled labor in biotech and pharmaceuticals, especially also manufacturing, which requires workforce training and development, which initiatives have you seen being successful elsewhere?
Yeah, so issues of the challenges of talent and skilled labor is also one of the things that I hear about frequently as I travel. Earlier there were broader needs when the labor market was particularly tight. There's still challenges, and so that's something that we certainly think about. There are a range of different initiatives that we are involved with, and I think this is yet another challenge that is going to take all of us working together to address, but maybe it's helpful for me to just mention an example or two of some of the kinds of work that we've done. One example is related to the Working Places Initiative that I mentioned briefly earlier in Springfield, Massachusetts. That team focused on things related to workforce. They had more than 40 different initiatives that were workforce related, and by pulling them together, the Springfield Works team was able to help provide a much more structured environment to help promote workforce development, and so that's one example that I would point to. One of the places I'm going to be in Vermont is actually a different Springfield, Vermont, and they're also looking at some of the issues related to helping develop workforce pipelines and skills. They're looking more at some of the impediments that people might find, and so addressing childcare and things like that. So, it's a multifaceted challenge, and again, it's one that we certainly care about. It relates to maximum employment, but it's going to take many parts of our economy working together to solve.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Collins. Thank you so much for your comments tonight. I wanted to ask, what guidance can the Federal Reserve provide to local banks to help better prepare us for economic downturns, ensuring that we can also continue to serve our communities?
Yeah, so actually just yesterday, the Boston Fed hosted its annual conference of regional and community bankers, and bringing everyone together to talk about, again, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, to learn from one another and support some of that work is really important. I have to stress that banks of all sizes are really vital for the vibrancy in the economy that we see. And, and the challenges are a little different for banks of different sizes as well. And so what I would emphasize is, in an economy that's really evolving, the importance of maintaining, real focused attention related to a number of the different kinds of key risks, risks related to, to credit, risks related to underwriting, to asset portfolios, to earnings. And so those are some of the kinds of things that we talked about with bankers. But again, banks of all sizes contribute in very important ways to a vibrant economy. And in particular, many of our smaller banks are so key for small and micro-sized businesses. And that's one of the many topics that I frequently talk about when I am visiting different parts of New England.
Here we go. Eric Torcano, our new vice chair of the Bureau.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to know if you can elaborate, talking about skilled labor, can you elaborate how immigration affects our economy and employment in the state, please?
So what I can say about that is that the strong labor supply improvements that we've seen have been a key part of the favorable economic outcomes. So when you see an environment in which the economy is growing rapidly and you have disinflation, that the explanation for that typically is strong supply developments, and labor supply increases, both labor force participation and also immigration has been key to that. That's been true across the nation, and that certainly has been part of the story here in New England as well. And again, we continue to watch all of the different data, and over time it will become easier to parse out the particular impacts of different factors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, President Collins.